Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, tomorrow it will be a year exactly since Jeremy Corbyn was elected as Labour leader. And what a year! Mr Corbyn remains the favourite to be re-elected in just 2 weeks' time, unless one man, my next guest, can stop him. Owen Smith joins me. Owen Smith, why did Labour lose the last election?
Because we weren't seen by the country as being a credible alternative to the Tories. We weren't, I think, telling a sensible, clear story on the economy and all sorts of other things. And that's what we've got to become once more.
And yet, in the course of this campaign, you are suggesting an extra £200 billion of public expenditure, higher tax rates and so forth. Are you not tacking sharply to the left in the course of this?
Well, let's be clear. I've not said that we want higher tax rates for ordinary basic rate payers or indeed for middle-class taxpayers. I'd be giving them a tax break by cutting back on the pension tax relief. What I have said is the wealthiest 1% in this country, the millionaires, ought to pay a little bit more through the introduction of a wealth tax. And crucially on the 200 billion.
But you also want a 50p rate, don't you?
50p rate, yes.
And a wealth tax. So that's high.
But that's
taxes.
The 1%. That's people earning over £150,000 a year in this country. It's not ordinary taxpayers. £3 billion for the 50p rate and a further £3 billion for a wealth tax.
Is that enough to cover your huge expanse in public spending? £200 billion is a vast amount.
No. The £200 billion is borrowing. So at the point at which interest rates are lower than they've been for generations, for 300 years, in fact, I think it's right for us to borrow. Well, and the Tories agreed, because the Tories in their recent leadership contest, several of them were proposing precisely what I'm proposing, slightly less generous. They were talking about £100 billion worth of borrowing through issuing what are called long-dated government gilts, debt of around 50 years duration. No economist in the country has disagreed with me about that.
So, well, the IFS disagrees with you fundamentally about how much the 50p rate would raise. They say 100 million, much less than you do. A much smaller amount. And these big taxes, unless they're really savage and they bite on people's property and their pensions and their stock markets, shares and so forth, don't tend to raise the money that people expect.
Well, we had an argument about this at the time, didn't we? And looking back in retrospect, it is clear that people did take money earlier or defer payment, and we would have got an extra £3 billion if we'd kept that tax rate at 50%. We argued about this, I argued about this as the Shadow Exchequer Secretary at the time, and I think most people agree that actually over time you would get £3 billion a year extra. All of the taxes I talked about raise £13.5 billion extra in revenues. That would allow me to spend extra money on the NHS, another £60 billion over the spending period.
But in terms of the Labour election, it does sound like a strange kind of reverse Dutch auction, where you're saying £200 billion, John McDonnell is saying, no, £500 billion. If much higher public spending is the answer to Britain's difficulties, why is he not right and you wrong?
Well, therein lies the big difference between me and Jeremy and John, if you like, because I think credibility is our problem. I've said explicitly how we would raise that money, and no economist in the country has disagreed with me about the ability of the British government to issue long-dated debt. We do it all the time. But John McDonnell has said he wants to raise £500 billion. He says he's only going to do that through increasing the productivity in the economy and getting tax avoidance down. Now, tax avoidance will raise maybe 30, 40 billion if we're lucky. And John's talking about increasing the productivity by £500 billion over a 5-year period. That's incredible.
You seem to be talking very, very big numbers.
Well, but you've got to understand the numbers. I don't think John does sometimes.
All right, let's talk about one of the other big areas where you differentiate yourself from Jeremy Corbyn, which is your attitude to Brexit.
Yeah.
I simply don't understand what your proposal is. You think the British people should have another chance to think about it, possibly at a general election. But what happens then?
My view about this is really simple. It's not that we instantly need a second referendum. We need to get to the point at which we know what Brexit actually means. We've been debating it this morning. Theresa May says Brexit means Brexit. The Brexiteer said it was an extra 350 million quid a week. None of that's true. So let's find out what it actually is going to mean. I suspect it means worse terms and conditions. I suspect it's opening up the NHS to more competition.
But with respect, you can do nothing about it. Next year, Article 50 is triggered. The Prime Minister has been absolutely clear on this programme. No, she said again on this programme, next year it's going to be triggered. and she has no plans for any kind of election until 2020. If it's triggered next year, we leave in 2019. So
Yes.
by the time of the next election, if you were elected as a Labour Prime Minister, it would all be over. What would you do then?
Well, you're right. If she were to trigger Article 50 before the British public knows what the real Brexit deal is, I think that would be dereliction of duty on her part.
Well, she has to, because that's when the negotiations
No,
start.
I don't think that's right.
The
I think
EU
she's
have
already
said we won't negotiate
I think
until
she's
it's
already,
triggered.
look, she's already negotiating with the States, with Australia, with Japan about the sorts of trade deals. She's already thinking, I'm sure, about what sort of changes to workers' rights and terms and conditions she will want to impose.
Well,
Nigel Lawson says it's time to
okay.
finish Thatcher's revolution. So my point is simple. Once we know what the deal is, that's the point at which you have an extra democratic moment in Britain, and either at a general election, with Labour arguing we should stay in, because the terms of the deal are not what were promised to the British public, or if she hasn't triggered Article 50.
But it's
a second
overwhelmingly
referendum.
likely that she does what she says she's going to do and triggers Article 50 next year.
At which point it's finished, isn't it? At which point
negotiations
we'll leave.
start, we leave in 2019. You become the Labour Prime Minister in 2020, perhaps, and then what do? Do you apply for Britain to rejoin the EU, or do you just shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's all over?
I think it's very hard to answer because it's a hypothetical question. But I think if at that point we'd gone into a
very hypothetical question.
At that point, if we'd gone into a further recession, if we had the prospect of another 10 years of Tory austerity, if they were saying the price for our staying out is opening up the NHS to private sector competition and is worse terms and conditions, more flexibility and less red tape, as the Tories will no doubt dub it, then I think the sensible and responsible thing for a Labour government to do is to say we're better off in the European Union.
So
and
reapply
put that to people.
Reapply.
Well, hypothetically, but it may well be, of course, that some of those things.
Reapply, because the trouble with reapplying, obviously, is
that
that
it would
as a
take a
new
long
member
time.
state, it would take a long time.
Yeah.
Also, we would have to accept the euro and Schengen.
Potentially, but again, we are getting into hypotheticals built on hypotheticals. I think the key thing is they've not said definitively. There was a couple of weeks ago they were briefing it might be 2019 before they trigger Article 50.
But the overwhelming likelihood,
we should be.
The likelihood is that you would become Prime Minister in a situation where we had already left the EU, and you're saying
That's
today
possible.
that, in your view, a sensible thing might well be to reapply for membership then.
Depending on what it looks like, yes. I'm an internationalist and a collaborator and a cooperator. I want Britain to be part of an international movement. I want us to be part of the European Union.
So if it's vote Labour and reapply, what does that say to all those Labour Party people who voted to leave the EU? In fact, there's been a survey done by an academic which suggests that something like 7 out of 10 Labour constituencies probably voted to leave, and in massive numbers in the northeast of England and in the Midlands. Those people will look at Owen Smith and will say, hold on a second, he is ignoring what we chose to do. He is not taking us seriously, and that makes him less electable than, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, again, Andy, it depends, doesn't it, when this happens? Because if we've gone into a further recession, if the NHS is on its knees as it is right now, if we've got the prospect of more Tory austerity, then I think we'll be telling a very different story to the British people. And I think people in those northern cities don't want more reductions in their livelihoods. They want to see investment in their communities. And Labour at that point, at some point in the future, I think would make a really strong case for us to stay within the EU.
Owen Smith, your fundamental pitch is that Jeremy Corbyn is less electable than Owen Smith. What possible evidence do you have of that? He has been getting huge crowds all around the country. He's been addressing massive rallies. And when it comes to something like the BBC's Question Time, everyone pours over to him at the end to get selfies. Not, I'm afraid, to you.
Well, they did actually afterwards, and I was quite interested to see some of the Facebook pages from them saying we conned the BBC by saying we were Owen Smith fans only to turn up to big up Jeremy. But the truth is, of course, you can't mistake mass rallies for a mass movement. And the Labour Party has to win back 2 million votes.
He's had 300,000 people have joined the Labour Party since he became leader.
True.
It's one of the biggest parties, if not the biggest party in Europe. That's all his achievement.
True.
Doesn't it show that he has mass appeal?
He's got mass appeal, I think, to a small section of the electorate. The reality is that 12 million people are what we need in the Labour movement, voting Labour, in Tory seats and Labour seats. Jeremy, I don't think, can bring that along. If you look at the polls and how I appeal to a much broader cross-section of society, because of the extra credibility that I think I can bring to this and because of the clarity of what I've suggested, I suggest I'm in a better position to win those votes back than he is.
Final question, very, very quickly. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to win?
Oh, 10, absolutely.
10? OK.
Never answer 7.5, Andy. Always say 10.
Owen Smith, thank you very much indeed.